So you've talked quite a bit about stem cells, but that may be something that many people aren't very familiar with. So can you tell us a bit, what are stem cells? Where do we get them? Why are they important?
Yes, of course. Well, you find stem cells in pretty much every tissue of the body. So these are small pockets of regenerative capacity, or cells which are able to, throughout life, repair the tissues in which they themselves reside. So they have the capacity to differentiate into a number of different cell types that make up that tissue, and so they're able to repair the tissue over time if necessary. So stem cells are extremely important, but the problem with most populations of stem cells in the human is that they are what are called multipotent. So they have that capacity to make many different cell types, but they certainly can't make every cell type of the body. But there are populations of stem cells which are said to be pluripotent, which do have that capacity. So one cell can quite literally make any one of the around about 210 cell types that make up the human body. The trouble is that you only normally find those during embryonic development. So the very early embryo has these pluripotent cells which will differentiate and then form all of the tissues of the body. But they're lost very early in development, so only a few days after implantation in the uterus, pluripotency is actually lost. So it's a very useful property which is very difficult to access in the human. But just recently, or back in 2006 actually, so I guess 10 years ago now, a group in Japan reported the ability to take just normal, fully differentiated cells. They actually used fibroblasts from the skin of an individual and were able to reprogram those cells back to a state of pluripotency, which was almost indistinguishable from those early embryonic stem cells. So we can now actually just take any cell type from an individual and reprogram them back to pluripotency and then re-differentiate them into any cell type which we require from that individual. And that, of course, has completely transformed the whole field of stem cell biology.
And so, what does research and use of them allow us to do? You've touched on some aspects of that.
Well, these pluripotent or induced pluripotent stem cells are extremely useful for a whole variety of different purposes. So they can be used as models of human disease, for instance, which allow us to gain a much better understanding of the disease process. So we can, for instance, take just a few of those cells from the dermis of an individual that has a disease state that we don't fully understand, and then reprogram those back to pluripotency and then re-differentiate them into the very cell types which are normally affected by their disease. And of course, by taking them from somebody who's suffering from that disease, we've effectively captured the genetics that has led or predisposed that individual to developing the disease state. And so we can now actually study it in great detail in the laboratory, and of course use those cells as a way of trying to identify the genes that were responsible, but also screen compounds to try and find drugs which might intervene in the disease process. So that's one particular use of these cells. The other, of course, is that we may be able to differentiate them back into cell types which could be useful for curing the disease state that they're actually experiencing. And that's a whole area that's now known as regenerative medicine or cell replacement therapy. So for instance, for somebody with Parkinson's disease that loses all of their dopaminergic neurons in the striatum of the brain, we can now just take that small piece of skin, make pluripotent stem cells and re-differentiate those into dopaminergic neurons. And potentially at least, that could be used to replace those cells in their brain and then overcome the disease state. So it's a very powerful technique which we think may one day actually be very useful for treating diseases of all types.